I'm now in my 40s. It's really hard for me not to think to myself, well, I need to get myself back to the way I was running when I was 25. I mean, the likelihood of that happening and doing the same training volume that I was doing when I was 25 is not being very honest with myself.
This is Running for Real, the podcast for runners who know that for every runner's high, there are just as many lows. All those just missed PRs, easy runs that feel hard, injury blues, and more. Each week, we'll talk to running, health, and wellness experts about their highs, lows, and best advice to build our confidence. Running for Real is about being honest, being brave, and most of all, not feeling alone. And now here's our host, who had white blonde ringlets as a young child, Tina Muir.
Hello, my friends. Welcome to episode 75 of the Running for Real podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. I know there are plenty of places that you could be listening to other podcasts. You could be listening to music. So thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoy this run or these chores or whatever you're doing a bit more, because we have something interesting for you to learn from today. Last week, we had Chrissy Wellington on the show. Chrissy is a 4-time world Ironman champion. And yes, she is a triathlete, but she's also a runner. And if you need more convincing of that, she ran a 2:44 as part of one of her triathlons once. Amazing, right? Chrissy and I talk about her new book, To the Finish Line, and kind of a lot of the topics that she covers in that and how that can help you as a runner. But we also dive into more deep topics like her struggles with an eating disorder and how you can run without expectation. Now, today, I'm excited to have another expert in the field of biomechanics, and this guy knows his stuff. Willie is as humble as it gets. You'll soon hear that in this episode, but he's one of the leaders in the industry and he flies all over the world to give talks and presentations. I wanted to have Rich on to ask him about all these studies he's been doing, as there are loads of them. And there's a lot of the topics that he covers are things that I know you will be really interested in. He loves to run and he's just trying his best to find out what we can do to stop injuries in the future. Now, just one apology. I had got up really early that day. We recorded this episode to do a run, and I hadn't had much sleep the night before because guess what? I was thinking about that run, doing that workout at an early morning hour. And so I did the usual runner thing of overthinking it, staying up all night, just not being able to sleep. And therefore, I was feeling quite tired when we recorded this, so I apologize for stumbling over some of the questions, but I couldn't get my brain working correctly, and I'm sure some of you can understand what that feels like sometimes. So after a quick word from our sponsors, we'll be right to the episode. Thank you to Body Health for sponsoring this episode of the Running for Real podcast. Perfect Amino has been supporting me in my training for years now, and I need it even more now I'm trying to get back into running. I forgot how sore you get when you start running again, but at least I know I have something in my corner to help me recover. Remember, coupon code TINA10 will get you 10% off at bodyhealth.com. This podcast is sponsored by Hoka One One. Hoka One One is a running shoe unlike any other, and you're going to love it. If you haven't tried them yet, what are you waiting for? Run in their newest release, the Bondi 6. Run for any distance with a plush, soft ride. The Bondi 6 is the sweetest cushion. Rich, thank you so much for being here today on the Running for Real podcast. I have to say I am absolutely just over the moon that you are here right now. You're someone I've looked up to for many years, and I really am looking forward to kind of diving in deeper to what you've learned, because I think it's going to be really applicable to my audience today. So thanks for being here. Oh yeah, thank you. It's a real honor to be on your show, and thanks for taking the time to speak with me. Oh no, thanks. I'm not the world traveler doing conferences all over the place, which I was just saying to you beforehand, and for my listeners. It seems like every time I turned around the last few months, I've seen Rich doing a speech or a talk, or I don't know what the word would be. I guess it would be a talk. Talk. In different places all over the world, and, people going to see you. So it's really, really cool to be able to learn from you. And you've obviously, if you've perfected a talk, then you've been able to kind of get the words together for what you've learned. So this is going to be fun to dive in. But, you are a physical therapist, one of the leaders in research on biomechanics, which is very exciting. And I know my audience love that. But when for you did this kind of area come up in your interest? When did it get on your radar to where you wanted to kind of learn more and specify into that?
Well, I've been a runner for, I think ever since 8th grade or something like that. I ran cross country and track in high school. I was a swimmer mainly. And so I've always kind of been interested in running. I would say that, I'm not a natural runner by any means. And so I guess I've always kind of had to think a little bit harder about it. But once I got to college, I continued to run recreationally. And, I think like most folks who run, I ended up getting injured a lot. And then I ended up kind of drifting toward PT school. So I graduated from Ohio University with my physical therapy degree in 1999, which is suddenly is now a long time ago. But once I got out, I started treating in like an outpatient orthopedic setting. And I kind of started seeing more and more runners, particularly when I was working in Colorado. And I started to get a real interest in the running research. And one of the things I found was that there just really wasn't a lot of stuff out there yet that I thought had a lot of that translated well to clinical practice. So for me, I kind of was left wanting often when I was reading literature and felt like I was having to come up with a lot of stuff on my own when I was treating patients. So I went back and got my PhD at the University of Delaware with Irene Davis, who's a leading running researcher. She's now up at Harvard, and really got into running biomechanics and running injuries and shoe evaluations and gait retraining and so forth. And then since then, I've been kind of doing running related research and just continuing to treat patients and so forth. And it's just a real passion of mine. It's something that I think about all the time. I wake up thinking about it and I go to bed thinking about it. And I run regularly, and I'm always kind of thinking about some of the stuff that still needs to be done from a research standpoint. So yeah, for sure.
And have you had some moments where, maybe you were treating someone and you were able to, I'm sure you've had multiple of these, but some moments where you've been treating someone and you've applied something that one of your research studies has covered, and it's worked and it's got them healthy, or it's changed something that needed to be changed, and they've seen huge improvements because of it. I mean, that must be a pretty good feeling, and I'd imagine that happens quite a lot with, like you said, initially there wasn't much out there, but you kind of went out and did your own stuff.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there are so many great running researchers out there now, and I think everybody's really generating such great content. So it's really nice to kind of take what I'm doing and combine it with others, and work with patients and try to come up with the best high value care for them. That's not to say that we have all the answers yet, for sure. And there are a lot of injuries out there that I don't think we understand very well, like anterior compartment syndrome would be, one that comes to mind that's a little bit difficult to treat. But yeah, for sure. I think if we can kind of combine a lot of the great research that's coming out from a biomechanics standpoint, but also look at some of the training load research, so training errors and so forth, like doing too much too soon, kind of work, and really think about the psychology of your patient and work together as a team. I think it is a very satisfying thing, and it's something that with my job, treatment is not a major part of my job. I still treat several hours each week. It's something that I really enjoy, and I get a lot of satisfaction out of it. But at the same time, I'm also, working with patients and coming up with new hypotheses to test in our laboratory and so forth. And yeah, it is hugely satisfying for sure.
Yeah, I'm sure. And on that note, you mentioned about, being satisfying, and I mentioned to you before that when I had Max Paquette on the show, who I know is another person that you look next to, I guess, look up to, with the work sure. that he has done. He talked about it being quite frustrating, that he thought he would kind of get all the answers and be like, okay, here's the solution. But he said that he found that the more he knew, the more he realized that he actually didn't really know anything or knew very little. So have you kind of had that same experience, that you thought you'd be able to kind of, check off things of how to fix things, but actually the more you dig into it, the more you find that there's so much left to learn? Yeah,
definitely. I mean, I think for, coming up with like optimal care for runners, I think we're not there yet. I think when you look at, like your most common running related injuries, Achilles tendinopathy, patellofemoral pain, iliotibial band pain, those injuries are associated with a really high rate of recurrence. Achilles tendinopathy, for instance, about 45% of all people who fail conservative care. If you've had a tibial stress fracture in the past, you have a 600% increased risk of having a second one. So we definitely don't understand like optimal care for these patients, because these patients are going through rehab and a lot of them are still getting injured again. A lot of them we're having some really nice success with, but I think those individuals that we're failing, I think we can learn a lot from them for sure.
So you mentioned about, having repeat injuries and especially the 600% you just said there. Is that in the same area, like the same spot gets re-injured, or is it to do with the biomechanics that it tends to be someone who has been who's putting stress on that particular bone or that particular muscle will continue to put stress on that muscle? Or is it the exact same point that is just weaker?
It's a little bit of both, I think. I think so. So if you've had patellofemoral pain in the past, you're likely to have that injury again. But let's take a tendinopathy, for instance, or tendon pain. If you've had Achilles tendinopathy, the likelihood that you might get Achilles tendinopathy again is quite high. But also the likelihood that you're going to get another tendon injury is also kind of high. So your likelihood of getting something like gluteal tendinopathy, which is lateral hip pain, increases as well. And so I think there's a lot of things that are going into that. And one of those would be just overall tissue quality. So I think that, and when you think about what makes our tissues really resilient to load, a lot of it is consistent training and good training practices, and so forth. So if that individual, if they got injured originally by making some sort of training error, the likelihood that they're going to continue making those training errors in the future is probably pretty good. So I think that a lot of times, the way that we run and decisions that kind of are what factors into our decisions with our training loads, those things often don't change within an individual unless there's a lot of counseling that's happening there with the patient. And so, I think we all tend to kind of make the same mistakes over and over again, whether that's with running or other aspects of our lives. And so I think that it comes back to like the overall athlete as a whole. I think it's also very hard to change a runner's kind of environment, and whether that be like the running surfaces that they're running on, maybe some of their constraints when it comes to time. But we're starting to really understand that a runner's stress levels can really factor into a lot when it comes to, why a runner might get a certain injury.
Any stress, you mean? Not necessarily just running stress.
Yeah, exactly. Like just life stress, So for instance, we know that, runners who have a high level of, perfectionism, for instance, tend to not allow themselves to deviate from training programs as much. And that can be really problematic. They can also really kind of set their sights on a certain mileage per week and be, not very flexible with that. So those things can really factor in. I think also, if we have just a lot of overall general stress in our life, rather than going out and, sticking with a certain pace, like if you're supposed to do like an endurance pace run, rather than doing that, a lot of times I think a lot of people kind of drift into that middle zone where they're running kind of hard, too hard to really recover, not fast enough to get faster, kind of thing, that type of that kind of middle zone that kind of wears us all down. But also overall life stress. I mean, that can really affect our sleep quality. And when we sleep and when we're resting, it's when we're actually absorbing training load and we're able to get stronger. So if you're not sleeping well, that also probably has a big role. And you see that a lot in the stress fracture literature. It seems like runners and particularly military individuals who are going through like basic combat training or something like that, if they're not getting a lot of good quality sleep, their risk of developing an overuse injury, particularly stress fractures, really goes up quite a bit.
It's interesting. And I guess it makes sense and continues as much as it can be frustrating, because that again puts you in that situation of where you maybe go to bed and you say, I've got to get my sleep because otherwise I'm going to get injured. And when I was elite running, I found myself doing that. I need to get sleep or I'm going to end up with an injury. But the more you do that, the less you do sleep. So it's kind of a catch-22 with that situation. But, we all need to do the best we can to put the practices in so we can fall asleep. And Thank you for explaining that. And it's something that is important. And Trent Stellingworth, I'm sure you've heard of him.
Yeah, of course.
Maybe not know his work. Yeah, okay, you do. He talked about, the same kind of thing. Juggling too many things is where you're, really getting yourself into trouble. So this seems to be coming up over and over again from, your group of experts who really are doing the research here. And another thing you've done research on lately, or kind of ongoing, is gait retraining, or just kind of changing, your running form. I did read an article or a post on running physio Tom Goome's website, and it talked about gait retraining and how it's not easy, but you can actually do it quite well in short term, but its lasting changes are pretty difficult to do. So what is gait retraining, and why is it not quite as simple as it seems?
Yeah, so gait retraining is basically just changing the coordination of your running pattern, and that takes a lot of practice. So generally, clinician might work with a runner and have them change a certain part of their gait. I think running cadence is an easy one to talk about. So that's how many steps per minute you're taking when you're running. Mm-hmm. And, there are lots of different reasons why someone may change the way they're running. But more than anything, there needs to be a very good reason for that. And so we can come back and talk about that here in a minute. But generally what happens in a gait retraining program is that a certain aspect of a runner's gait is identified that the clinician and the runner want to change. And then the clinician works with the runner to come up with the right cue so that they can work on this change. And again, cadence is a very easy one. They're just asking that runner to increase the number of steps they're taking per minute while running the same running speed. And then I think the overarching thing is super important is there needs to be sufficient practice. And so the number of repetitions, which would be how many foot strikes you're taking, is really, really critical. So just like anything in life, if you're not practicing it in a very structured manner, the likelihood that it's going to stick and become part of your kind of subconscious running pattern is not very good. So there needs to be a fairly lengthy period of time when that runner is working on that in a very concerted effort, and also with a lot of structure, where they're getting consistent feedback. And feedback is basically informing the runner, are you hitting this new step rate or cadence target? Are you falling under it? Are you overshooting it, or what have you? And I think that feedback part, where a runner is being told if they're making an error or if they're where they should be, is super important. But eventually the runner needs to kind of internalize this new movement pattern where they can you have to start weaning that feedback away or pulling it away, so that the runner is not so reliant on the coach or their therapist telling them if they're running with a certain technique. The runner needs to become more bodily aware and say, okay, this is feeling like I'm hitting this target.
Yeah. And so using that as an example, you said about cadence, that is a common thing that people talk about. What have you found about cadence? Like, is this magical 180 the right number? Like, what should people know about cadence?
Yeah, so we've looked at this quite a bit, and we've probably looked at hundreds of runners when it comes to looking at their cadence. And what we find in kind of your typical runner is a pretty wide range, anywhere from about 162 steps per minute the whole way up to about 188. So there's a pretty wide range, and there are a lot of things that factor into a runner's cadence. One would be, just the overall person's dimensions. So height, leg length, and so forth can factor somewhat, but also running speed, how fresh the runner is. So if the runner is very fatigued, we know that runners tend to take a little bit of a longer stride, which is going to lower your cadence a little bit when you're tired. And any runner that has, if they have their Garmin or whatever type of running watch, if they have it configured so they can see their cadence, maybe they've noticed this, that when they are like the day after a race or day after a hard track workout, they might notice that their cadence is a little bit lower. Yep. So it does kind of shift. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Well, yeah. Okay. So what we tend to do, and we do a lot of stuff with wearable devices or these running watches. We always validate them before we start using them in any sort of research project. And we find that, a couple years ago, they weren't quite as accurate as they are now. They are very accurate. And when it comes to cadence, some other metrics are maybe not quite as good, but cadence is a pretty easy thing to measure. And we find that we always compare like a running watch to like our gold standard, which we have this very expensive, very nice instrumented treadmill that is highly accurate when it comes to assessing a runner's cadence and amongst some other measurements. And these devices are really accurate, and runners can feel really confident in their cadence measure that they're getting from most of these running watches.
Okay, that's good to know. Yeah, and so you've kind of said here that it can really depend, and there's so many factors that come into the cadence. But should people be trying to increase if they are, let's say, I'll just take myself as an example, as it's easy to give numbers. I would typically find on an easy run, my cadence is 170-ish, maybe even 160s. But then on a workout day, it's probably 185 or something like that. So, for someone listening who maybe is thinking, well, on an easy day, mine is 160, and on a hard day, it's 170. Should I be trying to get it up to 180, or is it kind of one of those things where you just maybe want to increase slightly, but not think about it too hard because, you just kind of be chasing your tail essentially?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think when we're doing like track workouts, like 400 meter repeats or something like that, I think that's a different type of running. You're running. Okay. So your cadence is going to be naturally higher during that. But when you look at like kind of standard endurance pace running, whether you're running like a 850 mile and maybe up to a 7-minute mile or so, our cadence is really pretty stable, and it changes a few steps per minute in the average runner. Some more than others, but for the most part, it is a pretty stable measure. As I mentioned, sometimes when we get a little fatigued, it'll slow down. And certainly when we're jogging, and what do you mean by jogging is like, I think 10 minutes per mile or slower. And of course, these things are all relative. Then your cadence is going to drop off there too as well. But, I think that, eyeing like a certain target, what we tend to do, when we're trying to train a runner to run with a different cadence, we give them like a range. Okay. And so that they're within a target. So that might be plus or minus 8 steps per minute. Okay. And rather than giving them like a specific number, because there are certain things, running surfaces, for instance, that are going to really affect your ability to hit a certain cadence. Mm-hmm. I think like when you look at, a lot of times in the running literature, like Runner's World or something like that, you will often read that runners should be hitting like a certain cadence, like 180 steps per minute. And, that, sure. I think if you look at across an entire population, the average running cadence is probably right around 180. And that's what we found. I think we found it was around a 178 out of 200 and some runners. But there's a huge range within that. And we would consider that range to be all normal. So for a runner who's running at 172 steps per minute, and that's working great for them, they haven't had any injuries, they're running well, and for them to change their cadence doesn't make a lot of sense. And then you've got the runners on the other side of it who are maybe like 185, 186, which we would still consider to be kind of in your normal distribution of normal population. If we're saying, well, that person should be hitting 180, you're actually telling them to slow down their cadence. And that doesn't make much sense either.
Yeah. Okay. And then just on that note, so let's back to gait retraining and changing things, be it cadence, be it, an arm swing, something. Does it not become a case of you just kind of end up chasing weaknesses around the body? Like you maybe fix one thing, you get something to work correctly, maybe you do some strength training or something to get your body moving the way it should, but then something else comes up. Do you ever, even with maybe the top elite runners or someone you have been working with, do you ever find they get to a point where you're like, perfect, you got the form just how it should be? Or is it kind of an ongoing process and just that is how it is?
Yeah, so I think clinically, I've kind of really, transitioned or evolved when it comes to gait retraining and so forth. It used to be that I used to do gait retraining with the large majority of the runners that I treat, but I'd say anymore now I probably only do it with about 20% of the runners that I treat. And the reason for that is one of the things that I've kind of found is that, the gait retraining or the way a runner is running, it's probably important with some runners. But for other runners, I think there are probably some other things that are more important that I think if I'm looking at, I really want to change the least possible with a certain runner. And if I'm going to change a runner's mechanics, that's a pretty time intensive thing to do. And I have to get buy-in from the runner. I have to believe in it too. And I have to feel very strongly that it's going to actually make a difference for that runner, because anytime you're changing anything, whether it be, your running volume, the running surface, or the running mechanics, you are probably increasing the risk of an injury somewhere else in the body. Mm-hmm. So for like a runner who is a rear foot striker, for instance, if they decide to become a forefoot striker, what happens is that you're going to probably reduce some of the load on your knee, but you may increase your risk of developing like a calf or a foot injury. And so a lot of times what's happening there is that we're not changing the load. We're probably just choosing to get different injuries. Mm-hmm. And so you're just shifting that load throughout the body a little bit, just distributing it differently. So I think it needs to be a really well-informed decision. And so it's not something that I take very lightly. But yeah, for sure. I think that when it comes to runners, a lot of runners we have come in, they may have an injury and we don't change anything about their running mechanics. And a lot of times what I'll do is I will evaluate their gait. I'll just look at it real quickly. And if I don't see anything that I really want to change, the last thing I want to do is sit there and go through a runner's gait mechanics with the runner and point out all the things that are wrong with the way they're running, because I don't need them thinking about that. I really want them to kind of focus on, how can they make themselves more durable? And more often than not, that comes back to good training practices and a really good strength and conditioning program first and foremost. And the gait retraining is probably more of like a treatment adjunct, more than like the main focus on what we're going to do with a runner to help them get back to running.
Okay. And just before we move on, I want to ask you a bit more about those two things you just mentioned there. But are there any running mechanical things that someone listening might, maybe see a video of themselves or a photo that you would say, okay, if you're doing this, then you really should, try and get in to see an expert about this to try and work on your running form? Or is it just if you keep getting injured, that's kind of your guideline?
Yeah, when you look at like a runner's capacity for just running volume and so forth, the easiest way to tell that there's a problem is if a runner continues to get the same injury. Okay. So if a runner's had multiple stress fractures, that's a really good time. They've had a stress fracture, and a lot of times when people get stress fractures, those are kind of treated with rest and not running for a while, and then the runner goes back and they get a second one. I think that's a really good time to go get checked out by a PT who's really familiar with treating runners. And of course, at that point too, I think there needs to be a team involved. I think there needs to be a registered dietitian involved and some other things so we can really kind of take a real global approach with things. But yeah, for me, I think I would caution runners from saying, oh, look, all my mechanics are bad, I need to change them, particularly if they're not having any problems, because it's probably working just fine for them and there's no reason to change it otherwise.
Okay. And you mentioned, training principles, doing the correct training is one of the biggest keys. We're going to talk about strength training in a minute, but what mistakes do you see runners make often that, maybe mean they don't keep getting the same injury again and again, which would kind of, give a red flag for something within their running gait, but they do maybe keep getting injured in different areas or keep finding that they end up overtrained or something like that. What things do you see often that runners tend to do?
Yeah, I think the probably the most important thing that I see is I see runners maybe not being honest with themselves with where they are and who they are on that day. And a lot of times runners, let's take like a marathon training program. So let's say we've taken this hypothetical runner. When a runner's completed a marathon training program, they made it to their marathon, they finished the marathon, and it went great. They were very happy with it. Then they take a little bit of time off, let's say maybe a week or two. And then they start running again. But they weren't a marathoner before, and they've now completed this marathon. Suddenly in their mind, what used to be a long run for them has changed. And so now runs under 7 miles or 8 miles or what have you, they don't seem to count a lot of times with that runner. And so a runner then will kind of start running higher volume or something like that when maybe they just don't have that fitness yet. And so we all have to kind of be very deliberate in the way we're building things back up. Where I see this problem the most is when a runner has had an injury and they've maybe have had some time off, and then they go through PT and they've rehabbed this injury somewhat, but now they're starting to get back to running and they get really impatient. And a lot of times we put them on super structured, deliberate return to run program where maybe they just start off running for a minute, or maybe even 30 seconds and then walking for 3 minutes. And for any runner out there, that sounds like, well, that's not really a run. But for that runner on that day, it is. And that's an increase in their relative training volume. So I think being honest with yourself and not comparing yourself with the runner, that you were, a month or 6 months, or, I'm now in my 40s. It's really hard for me not to look back and kind of think to myself, well, I need to get myself back to the way I was running when I was 25. Yeah. And I mean, the likelihood of that happening and doing the same training volume that I was doing when I was 25 it's not being, very honest with myself. So I think that's probably the biggest training area that I see is living in the moment, I guess, when it comes to our fitness. I think is super important.
Yeah.
I think the other thing I see with a lot of runners, and I see this particularly with older runners and runners who are very pressed for time, is they tend to run the same pace for all their runs and not mix it up. And I think that's a big mistake for a couple different reasons. One of them is that you're doing a very repetitive activity, which is running. And then you're doing it in a very repetitive manner, meaning you're running the same pace all the time. And maybe you're even doing the same running loop all the time. And what I would encourage runners to do is really mix it up. Do a hill workout, like some hill repeats or something like that once a week. And then, a lot of easy runs. The vast majority of our running should be very easy.
And those easy runs will be the same pace? Like, within, obviously slower than the hard days, but is it okay if those runs are all the same pace?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. But I think overall, I think more variety in our running is really good. And Max Paquette has done some nice work with this. He's, one of the things that happens as we get older is we start to slow down a little bit, and we don't push off as much with our calf muscles and so forth. And Max has shown that if you maintain at least some high intensity running once a week or something along those lines, as you age, it tends to really buffer those age-related changes that we see in runners. But if you start, if you continue to run the same pace all the time, that doesn't seem to be enough to really slow down that age-related loss of running speed and fitness. So I think mixing it up, I think even for the runner who's not actively competing, I still think it's an important thing to have, like a weekly track workout or a weekly hill repeat workout.
Okay, that's good to know. Yeah, and obviously important to keep that in mind as people are listening do tend to get injuries quite often. This is something that is important. And, just one more thing with that you said about coming back too fast. Does it typically tend to be maybe not that initial period where you said it's, maybe 1 minute of running or a few minutes, but once things start to kind of maybe, I don't want to say click together, but once you start kind of sniffing your typical training, like you're able to compartmentalize when it's in that early stage, but then once you get to kind of, maybe 20, 30 miles a week and you're kind of feeling a bit more normal, is that when people tend to fall into that? Or is it in that very early stage and thinking, well, 1 minute is nothing, I'm just going to do 2?
Yeah, I think it's more in between. I think it's like once that runner is, makes it past that initial stage, maybe that first week or two, then they start feeling pretty good. And then they start kind of skipping steps in a return to run program. They start to get a little more impulsive because they start feeling comfortable. They start feeling like they've got that injury in their rearview mirror. But when you look at, let's take an average cross country, like high school cross country athlete. Now a lot of kids are reporting for, cross country training camps and so forth, or before, their conditioning before the season really starts. And the research is starting to show that injuries when a runner returns or goes and joins like a training group, they don't really show up immediately. They actually start peaking around the 3rd week. And so that's when medial tibial stress syndrome, which is one of the main injuries that high school cross country runners get, those tend to peak in the 3rd to 4th week. And that's because that's when we start to break down. That's when the training load, the cumulative effects of that kind of start really building up. And when our body really is really struggling keeping up with that increase in training load. And you see that mostly in runners who, maybe weren't super consistent over the summer with their training practices. So taking it back to the injured runner, Again, I think that third and fourth week is probably the most dangerous time for them because they start feeling really confident and they start really ramping their mileage up. But they really still need to kind of adhere to the same principles of just, really gradual change, because our tissues, whether it be bone or tendon, can really only adapt to training load, to very small increases in training loads.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for explaining. Okay, we'll get on to strength training in just 1 second, but one thing I've seen around quite a lot before we move on from this running biomechanics is I've seen a few things recently that have kind of said that everyone's running style has just kind of become their own ideal way to run. Like the body knows what it's doing, it knows how to compensate and run, in the most efficient way that it should. Do you agree with that statement, or do you feel like that isn't exactly the case? It just isn't really practical to imagine working on everyone to improve their running form?
Well, Izzy Moore, who's a researcher out of the UK, she's done some really nice work with looking at changes in running mechanics as a runner becomes more fit. And one of the things that happens is that the more we run, our running mechanics kind of tend to evolve along the way. We become more efficient with our running mechanics. And that is kind of a real organic process. It doesn't really take a lot of deliberate training to say, okay, I'm going to start moving a little bit differently. So our running mechanics kind of change as we get a little bit more fit. But as far as like an ideal running mechanic for someone, I would say that I probably subscribe more to like everybody kind of has their own movement pattern that is going to work for them. And, so even if I have a runner who has patellofemoral pain and I do gait retraining, it used to be that I said like, okay, we have to change this person's running mechanics and we have to fix it. And if they start drifting back toward their old mechanics, they have to come back in and they have to get like a tune-up with me. I have to, okay, let's work on this again. And the easy one would be if someone's knee is diving medially too much, so their knees kind of collapsing inward, which is a mechanic you see a lot with female runners who have patellofemoral pain. But one of the things we found was that we did this gait retrain study where we trained we had a full-length mirror set up in front of a treadmill. We worked with female runners who had persistent patellofemoral pain, who had that mechanic where their knee was diving in, and we had them, work on using their glute muscles a little bit more so they could control their knee, so it wasn't drifting medially quite as much. And their pain got better and everything was great. They started, once they got done with these 8 sessions of gait retraining, they went back to their normal running routines and all stuff. But then we had them come back for follow-up visits. And that's one of the things we saw. We saw that their running mechanics started to drift back toward their old way of moving. And so at the time I was like, well, this is really bad. We need to get these people in and get them in for these tune-ups so we can work on, okay, you're starting to get back to your old way. We need to work on this and so forth. But they were in a research study, so we couldn't change what we were doing. But now that I'm like past that study and I look back, one of the things that was really interesting was that even though their running mechanics started kind of drifting back to their old way of moving, their pain wasn't changing and their function wasn't changing. In fact, their pain was actually getting even better. It was improving. So I think that when we look at when we change a runner's running mechanics, it maybe doesn't have to be a permanent change. It maybe is just that thing that they need to do to kind of get their running volume back up enough. And then after a while, they can stop worrying about it so much and worry more about using good training practices and things like that. And that's, end of the day, that's probably what's going to make a runner a little bit more durable than worrying about how they're moving and how they look when they're running down the street.
Okay. And another aspect that's going to, be a big part of this is, as we've said, strength training. Now, we're starting to hear this everywhere. I mean, you've probably known this for many years, but I'm sure many of the listeners are starting to say, okay, I get it. Everyone's talking about strength training. So tell us, what are your thoughts on, you've mentioned how important it is, but what does that mean? Can it be doing some 10-pound dumbbells, from your home, or do you need to work with someone? Do you need to lift heavy weights? What does strength training, from what you've found, mean that runners should be doing?
Yeah. So if you look at all the literature, when we look at, how can we improve important tendon qualities like improve tendon stiffness and improve the cross-sectional area, which is the thickness of the tendon, which those things are all things that means that tendon is more resilient to training. In order to do that, you have to lift heavy. And, for me, I've always done some resistance training. I used to do, I think like most runners do, kind of high rep training.
Yeah.
So like 15, 20 repetitions because I needed to train for endurance and all stuff. But when you look at the literature, it's pretty clear that lifting and doing high rep strength training just doesn't cause the same adaptations in our connective tissue that you would see when we do heavy strength training. And what I mean by heavy strength training is, 6 to 8 repetitions, 3 to 4 sets of that, 2 to 3 times a week. That seems to really drive adaptations much faster.
Okay.
And when you look at the literature too, most runners are like, well, if I lift like that, what's going to happen is that I'm going to put on muscle.
Mm-hmm.
Mass, I'll get heavy. But we don't really see that in runners at all. What happens is that there's this training interference effect where if you're doing endurance training and you add heavy strength training to the endurance training, the endurance training kind of buffers our ability to put on a lot of muscle mass. So we tend to get stronger, and our tendons get stronger, and our bones get stronger, and cartilage gets healthier, and all that stuff. But we don't end up adding a lot of overall body mass. But back to the high rep thing, we just don't see those nice changes that are occurring. And I guess the way I kind of look at it is, if a runner really wants to do a high rep activity, they should just go for a run, and I mean, just go for a run because it's them spending time in the weight room doing a lot of high rep activity. They might as well go for a run and instead of, or at the very least, pick up some of the heavier weights and move those.
Okay. And is it a case of, how important is your form? My listeners know that I have a strength training program with my strength training coach, Drew, and we do, heavy lifting program for runners online. But we took hours and hours making these videos to make sure that the strong stars, as we call them, could perfect their form, could do the right thing. Drew explains each and everything you need to do. But is this a case of someone can just, find a lifting routine online and then go to the gym and do it themselves? Or, is it something that form is just so important that you, at least initially, should be working with someone, or at least having a professional that you can trust to kind of watch over you as much as possible?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you don't have much experience with strength training, I think you need to go probably spend some time with someone. Maybe it's just a couple sessions, so they can help you understand how to use dumbbells and weight machines and so forth. Okay. But I think really one of the really great things about strength training is that it's a really controlled movement, and particularly if you're on a machine. And, so you really can't get yourself into too much trouble there. But, back to the practice in our mechanics, when we're strength training, one of the things that I thought clinically before I went back for my PhD was that, if we had runners and we had them strength training, doing these therapeutic exercises, and, if I had someone with patellofemoral pain, if I had them squatting a certain way in the clinic and doing it with weights and all that stuff, that was going to magically change the way that they were running. It was going to magically change their running mechanics. And that was the first study that I did as part of my PhD work, is that, we found that it doesn't transfer to running at all. So you can have the best mechanics and try to, emulate your perfect running form when you're doing strength training. And that's great. And that maybe is reducing your risk of maybe developing an injury when you're lifting weights. But that's not going to change the way you run. And so a runner, again, I come back to what's truly functional. And if a runner is really worried about lifting a light enough weight so they can use a squatting mechanic, for instance, that they think will carry over to running, they should just kind of move away from that approach and worry more about trying to lift more weight, maybe get into a squat rack and really get in there and lift some heavier weight. And again, it's relative to that person.
Yeah. Yeah. And is it just about lifting heavy weights? Like, how does mobility and, stability exercises, plyometrics, things like that, how do those come into this?
Yeah, so plyometrics seem to really improve tendon stiffness, which again is something that we really like to see. And this stiffer tendon is going to store and release energy more efficiently. It's going to not develop kind of micro tears or micro damage with running quite as easily. So plyometrics is helpful, but end of the day, it's the strength training that's really the most helpful, because plyometrics help tendon stiffness, but they don't really improve muscle quality quite as well. So for runners like kind of pinched for time, I would tell them their time is best spent picking out 3 to 4 strength training exercises and lifting some heavy weights and just sticking with that stuff.
Okay. And I just want to reiterate one more time to people listening, obviously Rich is saying to go lift heavy weights, and I recommend it as well. People know that, but just be very careful. Don't, just go to a gym and start lifting some weights without looking up how to do it correctly, without having someone work with you and how to do it correctly. Because, the last thing you would want is to tweak your back by trying to just go in to a gym and lift a weight and not lift it correctly. So just wanted to keep that in mind for anyone listening, that this is something you probably need to research quite a bit, or at least go see someone to show you how to do it correctly.
Yeah, if I can just add something to that. One of the things that whenever I have a runner who's never lifted weights or doesn't have a good history of spending time in a gym, I generally recommend for them to take 3 to 4 weeks of lifting higher reps, of doing 15 to 18 repetitions, just a couple sets. That lifting at that stage, they're just kind of getting used to the movement, used to carrying weights, used to being around in a gym and stuff like that. And that's when injuries most often occurs in those first 3 to 4 weeks. So we generally start runners off with pretty high reps, but the goal is always to see if we can get them to lift in heavier weights down the road. It might take a couple months for sure.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And just before we move on from that, you did do some work. You've done some research on hip strengthening. So what have you found from that, and how can runners listening incorporate that into their training?
Yeah. So, I mean, when you look at when you look at the literature and stuff that we've done, we find that the hips are important for sure. But you can strengthen your hips all you want, and that's a really important thing to do, but it's not going to change the way you're moving. And so the question comes back, well, why should I do hip strengthening? Well, the reason is that when we do strength training, it does a lot more for us than just get us strong. And sometimes the process of getting stronger is really what's important. And so when you do strength training, whether it be your hips or your quadricep muscles or whatever, you're improving the muscle quality, you're improving the tendon strength, you're improving the bone strength that muscle is attached to, and so forth. But for when we look at patellofemoral pain, for instance, or anterior knee pain, which is the most common running related injury, it does seem that hip strengthening, particularly coupled with quadricep strengthening, is what's going to give someone the best outcomes. Mm-hmm. And again, going back to, I think, like Max's point in your previous podcast with him and what we were talking about previously, is that we don't really understand why that really helps. We don't really understand why strengthening your hips seems to reduce knee pain quite as much as it does. So strengthening your hips is certainly important. But at the same time, when we look at where our muscular force is coming from when we're running, it actually comes mostly from our calf muscles. Mm. And so, again, if I were to kind of give a runner advice when they're in the weight room, and if they just only have time to do one exercise, I would tell them to probably spend a lot of time doing some calf raises, because that's where almost 50% of our propulsive force is coming from our calf muscles.
Very interesting. Well, thank you. Okay. And one more study I want to talk about in particular, which you mentioned earlier, and I know that the listeners would have clocked it, was you talked about a wearable devices study. You've done quite a lot of things with that, especially related to injuries. So what did you find about when it comes to wearables? Can they actually help us, or is it going to be better to run by feel and they're just kind of overcomplicating things?
Yeah, I think probably a little bit of both. I think you hear about people who get a little hung up on like different social media forums like Strava, for instance. I'm thinking most of your listeners are going to be familiar with that. But for those that aren't, that's a GPS basically driven social media platform where you can see what other people are doing. And I'm on Strava, and I mean you can look me up on there and so forth and see what I did this morning for a run. And it's really hard when you're out for a run not to sit there and think about, I'm feeling kind of tired today, but gosh, this run's going to go up on Strava later today. And my brother, for instance, who's always checking in with me with my running and so forth, he lives in Kentucky and is a pretty, he's a pretty big runner as well. I'm always like, well, what's he going to think about the run that I did today? So I think there's some real pitfalls there. But on the other hand, I think that when we look at wearable devices, one of the things that they can be very helpful is being able to look back at what we've done over the last couple weeks. And, again, when we look at training errors, it's not necessarily the training error that you made. You didn't necessarily make a training error on the day that you got the injury. Maybe that's the case, but most training errors actually predate a running related injury by about 2 to 3 weeks. Okay. And so there's a ripple effect that is occurring there. So if a runner gets an injury and they're not really sure why that happened, it can be really helpful for them to sit down with a clinician and, go back and look at their history on their GPS, whatever account, and look a couple of weeks ago, so they can be very objective about that. And that's important because, there's been at least one study that has shown that runners typically overestimate the amount that they're running by up to 35% when they compare it to their GPS watch. So if you ask a runner, and we see this a lot, I ask runners when they come in for our studies, I say, okay, so what's your weekly running volume? I used to always say, they tell me I'm running 45 miles per week. And I'd be like, okay. And I'd write that down and so forth. But now that most runners have a GPS watch, I ask them to bring up their Garmin account or whatever, so I can really see what their running volume, their average running volume has been over the last month. Because a lot of times runners kind of say, well, I'm a 45 mile per week runner. And that's more their aspirational volume, or maybe they hit that once or twice a year. It's not really their true average. But the other place we've used wearables is for giving real-time feedback on running mechanics. Uh-huh. And for that we've used cadence because we feel that's a very good measure from most running watches. And with that study, we used a Garmin running device that gave real-time feedback on step rate, and we took runners who had very high impact runners, and these runners we decided were at high risk for developing some sort of stress fracture. And with that study, we gave them real-time feedback on their cadence. We asked them to increase their cadence by 5 to 10% over what they were doing previous to enrolling in the study. And we had them do that over the course of 8 sessions. And these runners just did their running on their own. We didn't have them come into the gym or into our clinic to do it. And then what we found was that the runners on average reduced their impact forces by about 25% over what they were doing before, which is important because these are runners, again, who had really high impact forces. And we know that if a runner is running with high impact forces and they're in a high risk category, particularly like a female runner who has a lower BMI, or someone who's in the military, those individuals get a lot of stress fractures. Those people can really benefit from reducing their impact forces. Going back to the wearable part, I think the thing that's really critical to that study that's important is that they did all these runs and all the training sessions on their own. We just helped them set up their watches, and we told them to do all their training on their own. And when you look at healthcare costs and how we can make things more cost efficient for the runner when it comes to time and everything from insurance and so forth. We were able to do this all. The runner was able to do it all on their own.
Yeah,
I think that's really important.
Hack it, can you? It just it is what it is. There's no kind of exaggerating or skipping mentioning things because it's. I mean, I guess you could delete something, but you can't really. It doesn't lie. So yeah, very interesting. Yeah. And what about heart rate? A lot of listeners are very interested in training by heart rate. Did you find that was reliable when it came to the wearables? How much kind of emphasis should someone be putting on their heart rate while training?
Yeah, for me, I haven't looked at that a whole lot. I've looked at the literature a little bit. It seems like the chest straps are the most accurate. I think the wrist mounted ones are not quite there yet. I think that they are getting better. That's for the ones where the Garmin or the Suunto or whatever you're wearing or Polar watches has a sensor on the back of the watch. And those seem to be a little bit more problematic when it comes to accuracy. But again, I haven't looked at that a whole lot. I know that heart rate can be really helpful for a runner when they're trying to kind of keep the cap on their pace, if they're trying not to run so hard. But one of the things that happens, and again, I'm not an exercise physiologist, I'm not a coach, but I can tell you kind of what I know about it, is that runners, any time, particularly when you start getting more dehydrated, you develop what's called cardiac drift. And that's when your heart rate kind of gradually climbs throughout a run. And that's not necessarily because you're getting tired. A lot of it has to do with the fact that your blood volume is decreasing because you're sweating. And so your heart has to beat a little bit more. So, where cadence is pretty stable across a run, your heart rate's probably going to drift some.
Does that happen with most people, or just as you mentioned, like if you're dehydrated or, some other factor?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think that's a good question. I think certainly when you're in a high heat environment, I think you're going to see that a lot more.
Okay,
sure.
Well, good to know. Thank you for explaining. Anything else about wearable devices that you've learned that listeners might find interesting, or if not, any other studies that, based on the things we've talked about today, things that you've found or have kind of surprised you that people might be interested in and find helpful to know?
Yeah, I think when you're looking at your average wearable device, I think most of the information these things are giving you is not good. And they're not very accurate for the most part. I think the thing to do is, if a runner is going to get really in tune with a certain metric that their wearable device is giving them, they should make sure that device is actually measuring that accurately. And so, we find that, distance with the GPS seems to be okay. Unless they're running in like a city where there are really tall buildings or
a track.
Or a track, for instance. Yeah, like if you're running and you've got a lot of tight turns, that really can affect the accuracy of them. Cadence seems to be pretty good. We just published a study looking at vertical oscillation. That seems to be pretty good with certain devices.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so how much you're bobbing up and down when you're running.
Okay.
And that metric you really can only get from if you're wearing like a heart rate monitor that has an accelerometer embedded into it, like for a chest-mounted strap, like Garmin has one that gives you like some run metrics, and that vertical oscillation seems to be pretty good. Okay. So, but the problem though too is that let's just say these measurements are perfect and they are really assessing a runner's mechanics really quite well. The problem is that a lot of them don't really mean anything. So they also have to mean something clinically. And so vertical oscillation, frankly, doesn't mean a ton. And really, cadence doesn't really mean a ton either, as we've talked about. It might be something that you might want to kind of manipulate if you're trying to reduce loading on a certain structure. But for a runner to get really worried about what their running cadence is in the middle of a run, particularly when they're healthy and they're uninjured, is probably not super helpful. So for me, I tend to tell runners, look, I think it's important to track stuff. So you can look back in case you get an injury, or so you can make some future planning on you can look and see how much running volume you've been doing consistently. But I really don't think we know enough about what truly causes running injuries to really say, look, this cadence needs to be higher, or this vertical oscillation, you need to keep it down to, you should only be bobbing up and down 4 centimeters instead of 5. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of, that's kind of silly at this point. So I would tell most runners just to ignore most of the stuff. A lot of it's noise.
Okay. And then I have to ask you, as a sciencey guy, you must love the data in some ways. What percentage or what runs do you tend to look at your watch, look at paces, look at the stats, and which ones do you run by feel? You personally, I'm talking about.
Yeah, this is terrible. Every run.
Every run? Oh, no.
I do. I mean, I really do. I mean, I wear a GPS on every run. I'm a mountain biker too, so I spend a lot of time. Every mile? Yeah, it does.
No.
It does. But I am really careful about my running pace. So, okay. I'm a data guy. I really like looking at the data after a run, but at the same time, I spend a lot of time. I really think the best metric for a runner is rate of perceived exertion. Yeah. And, keeping, and if that's even and that would be there are different scales out there, but 0 to 10 is the easy one. With 10 being as hard as you can go, and so forth. But, really, earlier we had kind of talked about how the vast majority of a runner's runs should be very easy. And the best way to kind of say or to determine that is it should be a conversational pace.
Yeah.
So, I think that's really the best metric. You should be able to talk to the person, or if you're running by yourself, you should be able to say the alphabet without hyperventilating.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're doing that, you're doing a good job when it comes to keeping the lid on things, because we don't typically get faster. We don't gain a lot of fitness when you're doing a tempo run every single day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And one more I will add, just for anyone listening, I also say to people to breathe in and out of your nose for the entire run, even going up hills, down hills, whatever. If you can do that, then you're running easy enough as well.
I think that's a good one.
Okay, great. Thank you. And just before we get on to a message from our sponsors and wrap up with the Running for Real 4, I asked Max about some of the experts he kind of sees as big people to kind of follow along and learn more from in the future. I know a lot of my audience loves this kind of stuff, or what the episode has talked about today. Who would you suggest that people can follow in the future? We'll get your information at the end of the interview, but are there any other experts that are doing some really interesting studies that you would suggest people should kind of follow along with?
Yeah, I think Chris Napier, and Napier, he's a PT, PhD, just like myself. And, I think he's doing some really neat work in that running injury space. So he's at the University of British Columbia. I think Izzy Moore, she's an exercise physiologist, I believe, and a kinesiologist, and she's doing some really neat work when it comes to the metabolic cost of different running mechanics. So she's a good person to follow. Both those people are on Twitter. Allison Gruber, she's a researcher at Indiana University. She's doing some neat work when it comes to running training load and shoes and so forth. And Max Paquette, I mentioned him earlier.
Yep. Okay, cool.
For sure.
Great. Thank you so much. All right. We're just going to take a moment to thank our sponsors, and we'll be back with the Running for Real 4. By now, you've heard me talking about how much I love Body Health Perfect Amino for recovery. But did you know that if you try it and don't like it, you can get your money back? 100% of it. That's how confident they are in what they are making and how much it will help you to recover. And hopefully by now, you know how much I appreciate it. Especially as I'm trying to get back to running after having a baby, and let's just say things break down a little bit easier than they did before, so I definitely need them to help me stay healthy. Perfect Amino is made of the 8 essential amino acids our bodies need them to function. And this will help it kind of work as it should be. And as a vegan-sourced, non-GMO, gluten-free, soy and dairy-free product, you don't have to worry about food allergies affecting your ability to recover. So with marathon season fast approaching, give yourself the best chance of getting to that start line healthy as those intense workouts and accumulated miles begin to take their toll. Remember, you can use coupon code TINA10 to get 10% off at bodyhealth.com. What do you have to lose? This podcast is sponsored by Hoka One One. Hoka One One is a running shoe unlike any other. Run in their newest release, the Bondi 6. It is a running shoe with a marshmallow soft cushion and marshmallow lightweight. In the 6th edition, the Bondi has refined Meta Rocker technology to give you a smoother, more balanced ride. It is shockingly lightweight for how much cushion it packs, and the Bondi 6 will give you maximum comfort in every mile. I know you think it's too late to start thinking about a new shoe for your upcoming races this season, but actually it isn't. I wore my Hoka One Ones for an hour the first time I put them on, and they felt great. The Bondi was one of the first shoes Hoka created, and it's become a fan favorite for good reason. Just try it on today and experience the sweetest cushion. Get yours today by visiting hokaoneone.com/runningforreal with the number 4. And use promo code RUNNINGFORREAL, again with the number 4, for free expedited shipping and become part of the family. It's time to fly. All right, just 4 more questions for you, Rich. Starting with, this is a bit of a different question. I'm not sure you're going to have one for this because I feel like you're a pretty it is what it is kind of guy. But the question is, can you tell us about a photo that was taken, maybe on your social media, maybe just, somewhere that you have that maybe doesn't show quite what it seems. Maybe it's a photo of you smiling, but in the moment you were quite frustrated with something. Can you tell us about something just to show that sometimes photos are not quite what they seem?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think sometimes I see pictures of like on social media, like after a talk or something like that, and it might be me giving the presentation or something like that. And I actually get really nervous during talks. So, yeah, I don't know. Sometimes I'm always wondering if my message is getting through when I'm doing a talk. But
maybe you look really confident and you're not feeling that way.
Yeah. I don't know if I always feel that way, So I would say that's one for sure.
Okay, cool. Thank you. What about a running for real moment? Something that only runners will understand.
A running for real moment. So that would be, give me an example. I don't know. I mean, for me, I would say that the thing I would say, I get injured. I get injuries just like everybody else. And, and I make training errors as well. And I think when it comes to me being thinking about, it takes a lot of discipline to really try not to compare myself with the runner that I was before I had that injury, or the runner I was in my 20s when I was in my prime and before I had a son and had other time constraints. So I think for me, for the runner, living in the moment and understanding and accepting some of the other life stressors they have can make everybody a better runner.
Absolutely. And thank you for admitting that, because obviously not easy to admit. And I'm sure there is some level of kind of imposter syndrome sometimes with you, feeling like you are the expert. You're supposed to be the one who knows better. But like you said, it still does happen for you. And also, as you mentioned, we're still learning here. So it's just because you're the one that has more answers than the average person doesn't mean that you necessarily have all the answers that are going to keep every runner healthy for the rest of their lives. So thank you for sharing with us.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
What about a high moment for you in your running?
Oh, high moment for me. I guess it depends on when you would ask me. I think maybe when I was in my 20s, I would say when I was running a lot of half marathons and I felt like I was getting relatively quick with those and so forth. But, I have a 4.5-year-old son, and there is nothing that's more important to me than, I did a race recently and he was at the finish line and he thought it was really cool. So for me, I think showing and modeling good behavior, which doesn't necessarily mean that I want I don't necessarily want or need my son to be a runner, but I do want him to have a healthy, active lifestyle. I think for me, that's probably the most important thing right now.
That's so cool. I love that. That's really special. All right. And finally, what do you tell yourself on the start line of a race?
Oh yeah. It's kind of funny. It's the same thing I tell myself, like before I do a presentation, that the race or the presentation that's even though I still get nervous, the thing I tell myself is that, what I'm doing that day is more of a celebration of all the work I've done leading up to it. And so, and again, just kind of trying to enjoy the process as much as possible. I think that's really critical.
Yeah, absolutely. Love that. Thanks. All right. And where can people find out more about you? How can they follow along in the future with what studies that you are working on now, or, just kind of if they are interested, as I know you retweet a lot of other people who you are, following and interested in. So where can they find you?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, and that's probably the best place to follow me. And that's my Twitter handle is rwilly. So it's RWILLY 2003. And then I'm at the University of Montana, and so I'm very accessible here. Anybody could, send me an email, and I'll get back to them as quickly as I can. And that's certainly a good place to reach out. I think if they're ever interested in any publications of mine, they're welcome to email me there. I also have a research Gait account, which is kind of that's a pretty nerdy place, but that's a kind of a social media forum for researchers where they can post abstracts from conferences and so forth.
No, that's cool. Thank you so much for sharing. And Rich, thank you so much for being here today. It's been so interesting to learn from you. And I look forward to seeing, what you come up with in the future. Can you give us a sneak peek of anything coming, maybe towards the end of the year? Or are you not allowed to say?
Oh, no, definitely. So I would say that one of the things we're working on is we're looking at maximalist shoes and looking at how runners move in those. So I'm looking at let's say an average runner who's running like a standard cushion shoe. What happens with their running mechanics when we put them into a maximalist shoe, and what happens when we put them into a minimalist shoe, and look at the differences there. I have a feeling that, at least from the data we're seeing so far with stuff, is that I don't think those maximalist shoes are causing some bad mechanics and stuff like that. They may look a little goofy, but I think they're pretty harmless.
Well, that's good to know, especially as Hoka One is sponsoring this podcast episode.
Oh, well,
I am glad to hear that you didn't say, "Oh, these are good," we're starting to find that these are the worst things ever. But I will be definitely interested to find out what you find with that one. And I encourage people to go follow you. Rich, thank you so much for sharing with us today. This has been so insightful, and I appreciate your time so much.
Well, thanks a lot for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Interesting, right? I know a lot of the topics we covered today, we have covered in some capacity on another podcast episode, but Rich explained a lot of it very well, and it just shows me how much we overthink things within our running. Even the experts don't put the pressure on that we do with these random numbers that we assign. Other than he did admit he loves looking at his watch, so he's just as guilty as we are when it comes to paces and looking at the watch. But now we have to stop ourselves obsessing over cadence. Now we have the information that we know that's accurate. Rich also talked about RPE, where you use perceived exertion to know if you are running at the right intensity. Now I have a PDF, a document explaining what I call the effort scale to help you with that. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes. So if you are interested in learning more about that, you can find that and download it there. You can find links to everything we talked about today, including some of the studies from Rich at tinamuir.com/episode 75. And next week, I have a very exciting one. I have Anne Ordain on the show. Anne was the first female professional athlete and has an incredible story. To be honest, I don't know how I've missed it in the past. From bone deformities in her feet, making it very difficult to even walk as a child, to wearing plaster on her feet and legs for 6 months, to running world records and qualifying for the Olympics, get this, 6 times. This is an interview you do not want to miss, and she has quite the story. So I hope you have a great week. I'll see you then.
Thanks for listening to the Running for Real podcast. Be sure to check out tinamuir.com for show notes and even more helpful running information.